Hello everyone. So if you'll allow me, I'll dive right into it. So what are those revenue sources that are good candidates for local government? Of course, we have first property tax, because basically if you want to avoid, the only way to avoid paying taxes, property taxes, is to move out of the country. So because of the mobile base there. And then of course you have other non-tax revenue sources, because that are good for local government, because basically they respect the benefit principle. Here you pay your taxes in accordance to the benefit that you receive. So you have user charges, for example, or fees on services, and license and registration fees, and public prices. So those as well tend to be good sources of revenue for local government. So when we talk about property tax, so what do we mean with the term property? So it can be either immovable or real property, like lands and buildings, movable or personal property, like vehicles or books, and tangible properties, like vehicles and land, and intangible properties, such as shares and rights. So we have to make a difference between what is a property-related tax and a property tax. So basically, property-related tax is a tax on ownership or occupation or transfer of property. But the property tax will basically largely refer to either an annual tax or recurrent tax on ownership of the occupation of an immovable property. So basically here we focus mainly on real property. So that's when we talk about property tax. So usually you will see people using that term a bit loosely. So for example, the tax on rental income is not a property tax, or the transfer tax is not a property tax. So why property tax, basically? There are some advantages related to the property tax, and why it is such a good source of revenue for local government. So first, like I said earlier, the property is fixed, and also is regarded as highly progressive, because again, the sum due here is largely determined by wealth rather than the percentage of transaction. So on average, the value, the proportion of taxes paid as a proportion of income tend to be higher the higher the income. So that's why it's progressive. So it's also considered fair, but as long as it's used to finance public services and infrastructure reflecting the needs of the population. It's highly visible, but that visibility can actually be good to enhance accountability and transparency. And of course, the land has inherent value. And if it's well administered, local authority can actually use that as a predictable and stable source of revenue, which also can be very lucrative. But as you will see, it requires a lot in terms of cost and maintenance. But there are some also disadvantages associated with property tax. It's highly political and unpopular, because also the other side of the fact that it's visible makes it unpopular, and associated with high administrative costs and cumbersome to maintain, as you will see as well. So basically, as Mick said earlier, it really represents an important, or if not the best, sources of stable, predictable source of revenue at the subnational government level, not only for developing countries but also for developed countries. But unfortunately, in the case of Africa, it still represents a very, very small portion of revenue at the local level. And for example, in Africa, so far, right now, the numbers is 0.5% of the gross national GDP, the product. As Moore said, in 1996, property tax is one of the most lucrative yet least tapped sources of tax revenue to support urban government in Africa. And unfortunately, it's still true nowadays. And one of the biggest issues associated with why it's such an untapped source of revenue in Africa, especially in Francophone Africa, that has to do with the issues related to land and property markets. So here we say that the state of the property market and land tenure issues in the countries can actually are very necessary actually to determine the appropriate valuation basis for property tax assessment. So the state of those two, the land and the property market, will actually determine what type of assessment you can do on the property. So you can either adopt a value-based property tax assessment or an area-based. So the ad valorem or value-based local property tax is actually the best in terms of providing that fiscal autonomy at the local government level. But it requires really a lot of cost, and also it will need to be implemented in a mature property tax market. So the value, if you adopt the value-based tax system, you can either implement a capital value-based system where you either decide to tax land only, or building only, or land and building separately, or land and building collectively. So you will see a variant of each of those in most countries in Africa. And another element of the value-based tax system is to implement what we call the annual rental value-based system, where basically the value is determined by the potential rent that you can get from the property. But again, that's different from the tax on rental income, which is basically an income tax. So the value-based tax system usually are preferable to the area-based because they're really good proxy for the ability to pay principle and reflect the quality of public goods and services. So your house will have the highest value, for example, if it's close to a certain amenities, a park or public transport and all that. So those kind of things will give a value to your house. But that, again, like I said earlier, requires extensive property market data and also a good deed registration system, which is not necessarily existent in many African countries. They're also really resource intensive and require at least valuation skills, capacity and maintenance. And in many African countries, you will see that the valuation tend to be quite outdated. We will go to countries where the last valuation has been done 30 years ago, without even indexing that to inflation. So the other system is the area-based system, where basically the assessment is done based on the size of the property, or a location-based system, which basically says it all there. So usually you will see an hybrid of both in some countries in Africa, where it's area-based and location-based as well. But these two tend to be regressive and unfair because and they're not directly linked to the ability to pay, and they're also they're characterized by a lack of buoyancy, basically because you link you assess the property based on the size of the property. For example, if there's economic growth, the value of the property will not reflect that growth, and then of course the revenue will not follow, so you'll have a lack of buoyancy there. But those tend to be simple to administer, and it's been said that in many countries that we don't have the ability yet to implement the value base, but let's start with the area base, at least to implement a culture of a compliance culture, and start making sure that people are getting used to pay, even if they have a nice little house compared to a mansion. Everybody in all those areas must pay. So therefore, in many countries, they would usually adopt the area-based property tax system as a temporary solution to move before establishing the value-based system. So in certain countries, especially in Francophone Africa, you will see that they will tend to encourage the individual private tenure, but they tend to forget the communal land issues and the land owned by customary or ownership of land, which unfortunately tend to be quite widespread in these countries. So you will see a conflict appearing between the national land tenure system and then the customary land tenure system, because you will encourage individuals to own land and therefore develop the property market. But at the same time, what do you do with those vast amounts of land that are owned by chiefs and villages as a community? So those are the conflict that usually arise between those two type of legislations there. And also, unfortunately, even when they allow that registration of land by individuals, they tend to be really quite lengthy and cumbersome. So for you to get the title at the end of the day, it can take actually many years. So again, that's a big impediment for the property market development in these countries. So it will usually result in land tenure informality, and of course irregularity there, and of course also the lack of the strict enforcement of the land registration procedures will again result in the significant illegal occupation of land, and again impeding or hampering the development of property market there. So, so these challenges basically will affect the property tax policy and administration in these countries, and again that's why you see that property tax is usually limited to the big the capital cities, usually the capital city, and then the major cities in these countries. Besides that, you will not see any property tax enforced beyond those cities. Like I said earlier, again, the value-based property tax system will only be justified and maintained in the context of a mature and well-functioning property market, and for the reason mentioned earlier, that's not happening, unfortunately, now in many countries, especially in the Francophone area. And again, that will also impede the transfer taxes, because if it takes you years to get your title, the deed, there's no way you will be able to sell that property. And of course, also it will require an efficient tax administration and a great supply of qualified appraisers. So you will see in certain countries where they have 10 appraisers for the whole country. So it tells you that it's not really at the forefront yet in many African countries. So as I said, the property market remains mostly imperfect in those countries, and as a result, we have a large informal property market. Because again, the issues are around land tenure regulations and title registrations, and again, that unresolved issue between customary rights on land and the statutory law as well. So what are the other issues and constraints around the mobilization of property tax revenue in those countries? The first one, I mean, one of them, besides land and property markets, has to do with the fiscal decentralization, because we can't talk about property tax without putting in the context of the fiscal decentralization process. Unfortunately, in many of those countries, fiscal decentralization remains just on paper. It's not actually being implemented on the ground. There's a lack of political will to do that, to actually push the decentralization laws and the property tax legislation. For example, one of the pillars of fiscal decentralization, or decentralization in general, is a political decentralization. But even that is not respected because the local the officials, usually local officials, are not elected but appointed by the center. And also the second and third pillar, which is the expenditure assignment and the revenue assignments, are also not respected. They will tend to devolve expenditure responsibility, but that will not be followed by revenue autonomy, obviously, because again they're afraid. They're afraid basically that they will empower the imposition and or lose political power, because they want to really keep the power to the chest. So giving out money actually reduce that political power. So that's usually one of the main reasons. So therefore they have to rely on transfer. And of course a local government that relies on transfer will have to follow what we call an upward accountability. It will not be accountable to the citizen, which is supposed to be accountable, because that's the point of fiscal decentralization, to bring the government closer to the people. So you have an upward accountability rather than a downward accountability. And of course, if you receive money from the center, there's no incentive for you to mobilize your resource, your own revenue sources. So again, it creates a disincentive there. But you also have lots of issues around just identifying the base, the property base. How do we make sure that we have the coverage ratios as close to 100% as possible? And really that's not easy, because first you have the lack of human and financial resources to allocate it for property discovery. And that's why we have usually poor fiscal cadastre in those countries. So the staff is usually not qualified enough, and of course you have inefficient manual systems to use to identify properties, like aerial photography. As in some countries, actually vehicles, you will see that they will use bikes to go from one jurisdiction to another to identify properties. And the lack of the adequate ICT system for data gathering and management as well. And of course, you will see that in those areas, the political leaders or the religious leaders in some of those countries, for example in Senegal, they will use the influence to make sure that the properties are excluded from the fiscal cadastre. And of course, there's also the lack of enforcement in taxpayers providing information. Usually it's based on self-assessment, and they will not be willing to provide information about the property, especially when it's area-based, the size of the property. So that, and also you have vast amount of land that is vacated, and it's difficult to identify the owners there. So how do we, so that's also difficult to identify and put them in the coverage ratio. And there are also issues around valuation. The valuation role, as I said earlier, are seriously outdated because there's a lack of trained skilled valuers, not only in-house but also government and private valuers. And because you don't have that, then you can't value property regularly, and therefore property tax will end up being not buoyant enough following the economy growth there. Also issues related to tax collection and enforcement. Again, like I said earlier, the lack of political will. You will see the leaders will say that a great portion of our population is poor anyway, so why would you want to burden them further with a property tax? You see the houses in townships and all that, so why do we even have to talk about that? So, and also, like I said earlier, political prominent taxpayers will simply use their influence to evade the property tax. And of course, high level of corruption within the tax administration. You will go to knock at somebody's door and say, hey, discover your property, now it has to be part of the fiscal cadastre. You just give me a bit of money to make sure it doesn't happen. So, and then of course the chronic taxpayer non-compliance, because the corruption obviously, and the fact that there's no compliance culture anywhere. And of course there's no fiscal legitimacy. Why would I pay my property tax where I see still potholes and roads and no doctors in public hospitals or teachers in public schools? So those are the issues. So we need to invest in reform, basically, in Africa. One, for example, a step towards reform is to really muster the political will to make sure that people, our leaders actually move onwards with the fiscal decentralization process and actually empowering the local communities, not only through fiscal empowerment, meaning elections. They must be elected, not appointed by the centers, but also administrative and fiscal decentralization. So we need to have that, not only the assignment of responsibility at the local level, but also revenue assignments. And we need to involve taxpayers a bit more in the budget development process, obviously, because they will be able to hold local government officials accountable. And that's also why they need to be elected, because if you vote somebody in power, you will have to be able to look at him closely to ensure that he delivers during his mandates. And of course we need to have that greater emphasis on land reforms and improvement of property markets. Again, another important reform is to make sure that we invest as much as possible into building as wide as possible fiscal cadastre, and for that we need an automation in tax administration, and also invest in those equipment that will assist in efficiently discovering properties, from the GIS systems to the CAMA systems, which assist in valuing many properties according to certain criteria as fast as possible, and obviously investing in skilled staff and registered appraisers. So overall, as we said earlier, property tax is not yet optimally used as an important source of local government. The potential is there, but it's not being tapped into. So mainly because of poor administrations in terms of coverage, valuation, collections, enforcement ratios, but also the lack of political will. And but there's possibility that property tax will yield actually a stable, if not buoyant, revenue for the government. And what can we do basically? How can we we see all those vibrant cities in so many African countries. How do we convince the government? How do we convince the businesses? How do we convince the population that property tax can be really good actually? So basically, how to sell the property tax. And one thing that has been suggested is basically to be able to present the property tax as a benefit tax. Basically something that is used to buy public goods and services, to basically use the property tax, present the property tax as a cost of purchasing public goods and services and specific jurisdiction amenities. So if you tell those elite businesses in the big capital cities in Africa that you can benefit from the property tax, from the public infrastructures to the activities around, to the services offered that will increase the value of your property, from healthcare, so police protections, the education, the recreational activities, all that. So present that as a benefit tax. Who knows what it can do. So basically, in a broader quest by Africa to mobilize resources, not only domestic resources that are sustainable for the government, we think that government will do well, basically, to add property tax in the portfolio, the wide portfolio of options that are out there to mobilize resources to finance development agenda in Africa.